It's a September morning in 1900. Dawn breaks over Yarmouth Beach. The grand hotels stand silent. The funfares are still asleep. But soon, this Victorian seaside resort will bustle with visitors. A 14-year-old boy will stumble upon something in the sand dunes that shouldn't be there. A young woman's body, strangled with a bootlace, identity unknown. What the boy couldn't know was that he'd stumbled into one of Britain's most controversial murder cases. A story of swindling couples, false identities, and a trial that would grip the nation. A case that would end with a man on the gallows, protesting his innocence to the very end. But was he telling the truth? Or was he simply a master manipulator, playing his final con? 12 years later, something happened that would cast doubt on everything. Quill & Compass presents you with this Victorian true crime murder mystery. Take a breath, relax your shoulders, and without further ado, I shall get into it.
The woman with no name.
The woman found on Yarmouth Beach had been living a lie. She'd registered at her boarding house as Mrs. Hood, a widow in town to meet her brother-in-law. For 8 days in September 1900, she'd been staying with the Rudrum family in row 104, just off South Quay. Every evening, she'd put her young daughter Ruby to bed, then disappear for many hours. The Rudrums noticed but didn't judge. Courting couples often took long evening strolls along Yarmouth's beaches. But Mrs. Hood wasn't a widow, wasn't courting anyone, and the man she was meeting wasn't her brother-in-law. On September 21st, a letter arrived for her. The contents remain unknown, but it apparently arranged a meeting for the following evening. She dressed carefully that Saturday night, selecting her best jewelry, including a distinctive gold chain and a silver watch. She carried a good sum of money in her purse. Around 9 o'clock, she was spotted in a local pub with a man. 2 witnesses would later swear they recognized him, though their identification would prove crucial and controversial. By 11 o'clock, Mrs. Hood and her companion had moved to the beach. The sand dunes were Yarmouth's unofficial courting ground, where young couples went when they had nowhere else to be alone. Another couple, Alfred Mason and his girlfriend Blanche, were sharing their own private moment nearby when they heard sounds from the next dune over. A woman's voice cried out,
"Mercy! Mercy!"
Alfred and Blanche assumed it was just a couple playing about. When they passed the spot 10 minutes later, they glimpsed a woman on her back with a man standing over her. The man looked directly at them. Embarrassed and thinking they were interrupting an intimate moment, the young couple hurried away. They'd actually witnessed Mrs. Hood's murder. The man who committed the crime melted into the shadows of the night. By morning, all that remained was a body in the sand, and precious few clues to identify either the victim or her killer.
The body in the dunes.
14-year-old John Norton made the grim discovery the next morning. The woman's body lay in the dunes. A bootlace pulled tight with a reef knot around her neck had left a deep groove in her flesh. Her clothing was disheveled, suggesting a violent struggle. But the horse and cart used to remove the body destroyed whatever other forensic evidence the scene might have offered. This was 1900. Crime scene preservation was barely understood. The police had precious little to work with. The mysterious Mrs. Hood had no identification, no obvious connections to anyone in Yarmouth. Her only visitors had been her young daughter and the unknown man she'd been meeting each evening. The breakthrough came from the most mundane source imaginable: laundry marks. In 1900, when you sent out your washing, the laundress stamped each item with your unique number. Mrs. Hood's clothing bore the mark 599. Somewhere in Britain was a laundry register that would reveal her true identity. Finding it was like searching for a needle in a haystack, and after a month of fruitless investigation, Yarmouth police finally called in Scotland Yard. The Yard's methodical approach paid off. They traced the laundry mark to Bexley Heath, where it was registered to a woman named Mary Jane Bennett. Mrs. Hood had a real name, and a husband who was very much alive. Herbert Bennett was a 21-year-old labourer at Woolwich Arsenal who'd been living separately from his wife for months. When police knocked on his door, his story immediately fell apart. He claimed he'd never been to Yarmouth in his life, a lie quickly exposed when police discovered he'd taken his new girlfriend there just months earlier. He claimed to have been working in London when Mary was killed, but his employer's timesheets showed he'd clocked out early that Saturday. Most damning of all, police found Mary's missing jewellery in Herbert's lodgings. The distinctive gold chain, her silver watch, items she'd been wearing the night she died. But that wasn't all they found in Herbert's room. Wigs, false beards, a revolver, and letters that revealed Herbert had been planning to marry another woman, a woman who had no idea that he was already married with a child.
Herbert John Bennett.
Herbert John Bennett didn't look like a killer. The newspapers made much of this during his trial. Here was a young man with regular features, wavy dark hair, and what the Daily Mail described as nothing repellent in his looks. He smiled for the cameras, his moustache carefully waxed. He looked like any other working-class lad trying to better himself, which in many ways he was. Born the son of a labourer in Kent, Herbert had lost his mother at 15 and clearly wanted more than his humble origins offered. He'd worked as a newspaper seller, shouting headlines about the great murder sensations of the day. The irony wouldn't be lost on observers when he became the headline himself. His marriage to Mary Jane Clark had been a shotgun affair. She'd fallen pregnant, and Victorian morality demanded they wed. Sadly, their first child was stillborn, but their second, Ruby, survived. They developed a life of petty crime. The couple worked as confidence tricksters, selling cheap violins as expensive antiques. Mary Jane would pose as a grieving widow forced to sell precious family heirlooms, while Herbert handled the business side. They were good at it, good enough to buy a grocer's shop, which mysteriously burned down shortly after Herbert arranged the insurance. But Herbert's ambitions extended beyond small-time fraud. The couple made an unexplained 4-day trip to South Africa that baffled investigators. Whatever they'd planned there, it failed, and they returned to London with their relationship deteriorating rapidly. By 1900, Herbert had grown tired of domestic responsibility. Neighbours reported hearing him abuse Mary Jane, calling her foul names and rejecting his daughter's attempts at affection. When Ruby would approach him, saying,
"Daddy, love Ruby,"
he'd push her away with disgust. Herbert had found what he thought was his escape route. Alice Meadows was everything Mary Jane wasn't: young, trusting, and blissfully unaware of his criminal past. To Alice, Herbert was a bachelor with prospects, a man who could afford diamond rings and first-class trips to seaside resorts. The problem was Mary Jane. Divorce was virtually impossible for working-class couples in 1900. Herbert had two choices: live as a bigamist or remove the obstacle permanently. His threats to Mary Jane had grown increasingly explicit. When she warned of getting him imprisoned for 15 years, he'd replied that if she wasn't careful, she'd end up dead. After Mary Jane's murder, Herbert moved quickly. He collected her belongings, ended her lease, and distributed her clothes and jewelry to his unsuspecting fiancée. Charming. He advanced their wedding date to Christmas, no longer needing to wait for his cousin to leave for South Africa. Alice never suspected the gifts she wore had been stripped from a murdered woman's body.
The trial and the verdict.
Herbert Bennett's trial opened at the Old Bailey in February 1901. By then, the press had already convicted him in the court of public opinion. Newspapers had paid witnesses for their stories. The more lurid, the better. Herbert's defense counsel, Edward Marshall Hall, fought desperately for his client's life. Most dramatically, Hall produced an alibi witness, Sholto Douglas. He claimed to have met Herbert in London on the afternoon of the murder, after the last train to Yarmouth had departed. Douglas's story was elaborate. He'd encountered Herbert near a boot shop, noticing the name F.K. Bennett above the door. Herbert had laughingly pointed it out as his namesake. They'd gone for drinks at the Tiger Inn, where Douglas paid for spirits before they parted ways. It seemed like a perfect defense. But Douglas's testimony crumbled under cross-examination. His memory was suspiciously detailed about that particular Saturday, but hopeless about any other weekend walks. Most damaging, why had Herbert never mentioned him when first arrested? Herbert himself had never mentioned Douglas when first questioned. He'd claimed to be drinking with 3 different men entirely. The prosecution made devastating use of the timeline. Herbert had told Alice he was visiting his dying grandfather in Gravesend. A complete fabrication. He'd been seen at Yarmouth's Crown Hotel, where he'd stayed during his earlier visit with Alice. Witnesses identified him as drinking with Mary Jane on the night she died. Then came Alice Meadows's testimony, and for the first time, Herbert showed emotion. This young woman he'd planned to marry described his elaborate lies, his stories about inheriting money from deceased relatives, his promises of a bright future together. She'd believed every word, accepted his gifts, planned their wedding. Now she learned those gifts were stolen from his murdered wife. Herbert's head sank lower with each lie. He could face accusations of murder with detached interest, but hearing Alice expose him as a fraud and a liar, that was his real torment. Most damaging was Herbert's own behavior in court. Against his barrister's advice, he refused to testify in his own defense. Marshall Hall had urged him to admit everything except the murder, the fraud, the bigamy, the lies. But Herbert wouldn't take the stand. His silence spoke volumes to the jury. Here was a man caught in lie after lie, surrounded by evidence of his guilt, yet unwilling to explain himself under oath. When the guilty verdict came, after just over half an hour of deliberation, few were surprised. Herbert stood as the judge placed the black cap on his head and pronounced,
"You shall be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and there you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may the Lord have mercy on your soul."
Herbert's only words during the entire trial came at sentencing. He maintained his innocence right up to the scaffold, insisting,
"I am not guilty, sir. One day you'll find that you've murdered an innocent man."
But was he innocent? The question would haunt criminologists for decades, especially after the discovery 12 years later on the same stretch of beach. Norwich Prison on March 21st, 1901. Herbert Bennett walked to the scaffold, still protesting his innocence. He'd spent his final weeks writing letters, maintaining he'd been framed by a corrupt investigation and sensational press coverage. His defense counsel, Marshall Hall, had worked tirelessly for a reprieve, meeting with the Lord Chief Justice and Home Secretary. Nothing worked. The execution was botched from the start. As the black flag was raised to signal that justice had been done, the flagpole snapped in half. Prison guards and watching crowds took it as an omen. Herbert's body convulsed for 2 full minutes after the trapdoor opened, an unusually long death struggle that witnesses found disturbing. Herbert was buried in the prison grounds, in what is now the site of Norwich's Roman Catholic Cathedral. Marshall Hall continued to maintain his client's innocence, writing to colleagues that he couldn't and wouldn't believe Herbert had murdered his wife. The case had too many loose ends, too many unanswered questions. Herbert might have been a swindler and a bigamist, but did that make him a killer? The press moved on to other sensations. The case was closed. For 12 years, it seemed Herbert Bennett's guilt or innocence would remain a matter of opinion. Then, in the summer of 1912, everything changed.
The impossible crime.
July 1912, Yarmouth Beach. A young woman's body was found in the sand dunes, 400 yards from where Mary Jane Bennett had died 12 years earlier. She'd been strangled with a bootlace. The police examined the knot, a reef knot, tied with precision by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The same distinctive knot used to kill Mary Jane Bennett. The same beach, the same method. The same killer? Impossible. Herbert Bennett had been dead for 11 years. Dora May Gray was 18 years old. Like Mary Jane, she'd been meeting a man in secret. Like Mary Jane, she'd been lured to the dunes at night. Like Mary Jane, she'd cried out for mercy before the bootlace tightened around her throat. The parallels were impossible to ignore. The investigation into Dora's murder went nowhere. Several men confessed, but all were proved to be fantasists or had solid alibis. The case remains open to this day, and with it, a permanent question mark over Herbert Bennett's guilt. Either Herbert was guilty of Mary Jane's murder, and Dora's killer was a copycat who somehow knew unpublished details of the crime, or Herbert was hanged as an innocent man of both murders, and the real murderer had been free all along. Modern criminologists remain divided. Some argue the evidence against Herbert was overwhelming: the jewelry, the lies, the suspicious behavior. Others point to the contaminated crime scene, the paid witnesses, and the media circus that made a fair trial impossible. What we know for certain is this: 2 women died on Yarmouth Beach, 12 years apart, killed in identical fashion. 1 man hanged for the crimes, though he could only have committed 1. The truth died with Herbert Bennett on that Norwich scaffold, leaving us with questions that may never be answered. The Victorian seaside, with its grand hotels and funfairs, hid something darker in those sand dunes, and whether Herbert Bennett was a cold-blooded killer or a convenient scapegoat, justice was never truly served. The mystery remains unsolved to this day. If you would like to hear more dark and macabre stories based on real history, do like and subscribe to our humble channel.